Hello, Internet. Welcome, everyone. This is a special IPython Jupyter dev meeting on September 1st, 2015. And this is going to be a show and tell from the IBM Emerging Technologies team. We have Dan Ghisolfi, Peter Parenti, and Gino Bustello, who are going to be demonstrating some of the work that they've been doing lately. So I'll let the three of them just introduce themselves and show all of us what they've been doing. They've been doing some great work recently. Some of it has been posted on the mailing list, and we will post this recording up on YouTube soon. Go ahead, guys.
All right, thanks. This is Dan Ghisolfi speaking from IBM. We're going to do three demonstrations today. As discussed on the mailing list, we basically have our first demonstration will be around content management. And this is work that stems from a workbench we built around open source Jupyter and that we were using with customers. And what we really want to do is we want to basically refactor that and take those content management features and contribute them back to the open source. So that's one thing we want to demo some of those potential contributions. The second thing is the notion of declarative widgets, and Gino's going to lead that up and demonstrate that. That's something that several people have been discussing on the forums. And then finally, Peter's going to demonstrate the dynamic dashboards, which brings together the widgets as well as some dashboarding app capability. What I'd like to do is go through all three demonstrations if possible, and then have questions at the end, because I want to make sure we get through all of this, like I would call it introductory demonstrations, because my hope is that following this conversation today, we will have the opportunity to kind of dive deeper into each one of these areas and figure out how we can best get this code into some repos in the open source, whether that's in a Jupyter incubator organization within GitHub, or whether it's into the primary. Okay. So with that, why don't we hand over to Peter, and Peter's going to go through the content management features as a first demonstration. Pete?
So first question is, can anyone see my screen?
I would encourage you to zoom kind of and maybe shrink vertically the size of the browser a little bit so that we have more horizontal real estate, and then crank up and then crank up the font size a little bit. That way, the actual content on the page will be a little bit easier to see.
Yep. How's that? Reasonable?
I would go even a little bit more if you can. I'm watching this on a phone.
Oh, okay. Well, if there's anything I start showing that you can't see, somebody just shout. I'll try to keep the chat window off to the side here. So, okay. As Dan mentioned, we had been working on this project, a pilot in Emerging Technologies, building, features around the Jupyter Notebook server, and some of them were centered around, we'll say, content management features. So these aren't, whiz-bang new visualizations, widgets, those kinds of things, but they're more largely around, what happens when I start using a notebook server and I start growing the amount of work I do as a data science consultant or whatever it is, where I need to keep track of code my team has written, code that I've written. I want to be able to dig back, find previous analyses I've done, pull code from there, reuse it. And, Jupyter is great for documenting everything in the notebooks, but we found, we want to improve the code reuse and the searchability and so on. So what Dan hinted at was we took some of the features out of this pilot that we did, and we're trying to package them up in a way that we can contribute them back to the open source community, right? So I'll just step through some of these. Again, there shouldn't be anything that's shock and awe here because they're very much basic features. I think actually do belong in the Jupyter mainline, but we'll go through them, right? So the first one that we've implemented is the ability to search, right? So we have this button, and all this, by the way, is done as extensions to Jupyter right now. We haven't forked, we haven't put it right into the mainline. This is actually using the extension APIs both on the back end and the front end. So we're using search library here to go through all the notebooks, actually search. I can search all my notebooks I've added. It's searching both the content and the file names. It's telling me what directories they're in, so on. Right? It's a search feature, right? Clearly, I could click any of these things, be taken directly to that notebook. I could click to open the folder. You'll see what else is in that folder. It's actually using Whoosh under the covers. Our original implementation was using Elasticsearch, but in order to get it down to a bite-sized thing that we can contribute back, we did a port to Python Whoosh, and it's just being indexed on disk and whatnot, right? It's actually re-indexing on the fly. It's pretty fast. So if we created new notebooks, it would actually show up here, right? So that's nice, search, how does it help me, right? So not only did we do it on the dashboard screen, we've done it within each of the notebook screens too. So if I search here, for example, matplotlib, it's finding all the code hits that have matplotlib. In our original implementation, we actually showed the snippet of code from the notebook that was hit. Right now, we don't have that implemented in our little port because, again, we're trying to validate the viability of this going out to open source, but that could be added, right? We could actually show the context of the hit within the notebook, right? Within the notebook, you see it actually grows a few extra options: insert path, insert import. Because what we found a lot of the time was, as we're working one notebook, it was, oh, where was that CSV file I need again? What path was it in? And you could start using the autocomplete, but often it's easier just to, search, find where the thing is that you're looking for. Oh yeah, let me get the path. Let me click insert path. What'll happen is it'll actually insert it in the notebook in the back. The insert import is a little more interesting, and what I'm going to show you now. We've actually implemented another feature. I mentioned code reuse as part of the Python work here that we've done, and specific to Python notebooks at the moment. We took I think it started as an example notebook out in the community of making notebooks importable from other notebooks, and we cranked that up.
It's an It was a little extension that Min had written to demonstrate that you could kind of hack your way around the Python import machinery to make notebooks importable.
Yep. So we cranked that up to 11, let's say, and went whole hog with that. It's a great concept because this actually stemmed from working in IPython 2. I think it was before the text editor came around, and finding that, we would code the same thing again and again and again. Yeah. And it was always copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste. Yep. Or step outside, go to a plain old IDE text editor, build a package, somehow get that up to your notebook server, share it with your team. We wanted something simpler, right?
Yep.
So like I said, we based it on Min's work. So we have an extension here. I can load matplotlib. I can load our little extension. By the way, Earth is just a play on the planet Earth. I know you guys like planets and heavenly bodies, so misspelled, yeah. So we did one, right? Clearly can change that.
Cool.
And I can start importing notebooks as modules, right? So we have this concept of cookbooks, which are really just other notebooks. And in fact, I might as well use the search capability.
Because she's basically working hard to get Peter Matt.
So if I search for cookbook, for example, right, I can actually pop this thing open just to show you what's inside of it, right? And this is a scikit-learn cookbook. I don't know why the cells aren't showing up completely, but there we go, right? So it's just a bunch of recipes for next time I want to do, training with k-fold cross-validation. Yes, I could type all this code out, right? But a lot of it's boilerplate, right? I got to go through import scikit, play with the sample data set, get back in my head, what was all the code to do this, stratified k-fold, right? Really, this is a recipe that I just want to change the next time I want to do this, right? And we've got this concept of using notebooks as these types of cookbooks, right? Not only are they educational in what I can do here, but they're also, I would like to take this code without having to do this, copy, right, paste, put in another notebook. Mm-hmm. I'd rather be able to walk back over to this notebook and, tap into the autocomplete, right? So if we were doing the cross-validation recipe, run that, see the complete example, right? So it's actually taking a rendering of that notebook complete with the HTML table. If it had a plot, it would be here, right? And then once I decide, oh yes, that's the recipe I want to use, we've implemented a magic to inject it, right? So now not only can I look at it from another notebook without having to walk outside, go get it, I can actually get the cells here. And of course, if I've done a good job coding my cookbook, right, I'll set it up with some kind of sample data. Here I'm using the iris data set. I just run it, right? Nice. Now, if I was trying to do this on my own data set, clearly the iris data set's not what I'm going to be doing, but I want to do a logistic regression classifier. Maybe I want to do a tree. I just changed this, plug in my own data. I'm off and running, right? It's code reuse in the sense of it's doing the copy paste for me in some sense, mm-hmm. right? That's one thing we wanted to show. Another one, though, which goes back to the search capability here. So if I search for another cookbook, I've got the second example, and I'm just going to click the insert import, and you see it automatically crafted the import statement for me there. Right? In cookbooks, the same thing. It's just another notebook, but it's got other examples of, I don't want to inject code here, right? I don't want to copy paste to the code. I want to invoke it like an API, which is more in line with what Min did originally, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do the same thing, right? We've automatically tacked on this help method. With a little bit of annotation, we could see what is help for a function, right, or for a recipe of code. I can get a complete example of how to use this thing. So this is a little play on Interact that lets us query data sets, right? And here it's showing me if I run this code against the iris data set, for example, I'll get a little widget, which doesn't show up just because we can't capture that part. That lets me, plug in how do I want to visualize it, right? So it's not so much the InstaQuery I'm trying to demo, though I'll show it in a moment, right? It's really this concept of, in other notebooks, I can have snippets of code that are reusable, snippets of code that are APIs, right? So that me, my team, we could stay within the notebook environment, share these recipes, share these cookbooks, right? And not have to copy, paste everywhere. So just to complete this, if we want to actually see this on the iris data set, in this case, it is a copy paste because it's an invocable one with a little example going with it. API cookbook, InstaQuery. All right, so the little widget that exists in that notebook and is defined by a number of code cells in this other API cookbook notebook defines, a query box, a group by box, right? I can run the InstaQuery and I should get the full pair plot here, right? I could say, I want to group it by species, run it again, right? These are the types of recipes where, I'm exploring off the beaten path. This is not meant to be part of the final notebook document showing exactly what I did. I'm just kind of poking at the data. Yeah, this type of API recipe, I call it, I look at the data, figure out what I want to do next in the main line of the notebook, and then I throw it away, right? I get rid of it. So that's a sample of some of the content management things. There's a few others in the extension. I think it's better to move on through all the things like Dan said. As I mentioned, it's implemented as extensions right now, but there could be a discussion about do they belong in extensions? Are these things that should be folded into the main line of Jupyter, like the search, for example, is sort of generic across all languages and use cases. Right? I'll stop there, and I think I'll hand to Gino for the next bit.
Very cool. Very cool. And by the way, some of these, obviously something like search is generically useful and would be welcomed by many users. Some of these ideas on code, more code reusability and making the notebook an environment where not just interactive snippets but actual code reuse is easier is something that is part of the work that we'll be doing over the next few years as part of the new funded effort from the new grant. So we're definitely interested in doing more of that work sort of in depth. So I'm very excited about this work, actually. So
yeah, and I want to echo that from what I had, the discussion I had at SciPy last week, where people would actually say that notebook generation is arriving into labs. And they basically copy paste everything around because they only use the notebook ever. That's the only thing that they know how to use. And they basically take code in libraries, copy in the notebook, change it, and copy chunk back into things. And they would really like a more progressive transition from notebook to libraries. And one of the ideas we had was also the ability to, when the cell is big enough, have a hint, which is like a button on the cell, which is turn this cell into a Python file or a Julia file or something like that. To say to users, when you reach a certain size, it's time to move away from the notebook or to make things into a library. And this would make things even more reusable, more progressive. So it would be really nice.
Yeah. It would be ironic if we ended up being the project that poisoned whose main claim to fame is that we poison scientists' brains away from the notion of learning to abstract code away into functions, and that taught a generation of scientists to copy and paste their way through their research. I mean, that would be our worst possible legacy into scientific research. So this is and there's some truth to that, right? That the notebook, by virtue of the workflow that it naturally supports, makes that path dangerously easy, right? the path of copy pasting a little bit too much. So it's something we need to think about, and we need to be proactive.
There's
about
definitely a serious risk of that happening.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't just hide away from that, and we can't say, oh no, that doesn't happen. No, we have to own that problem. It is a problem that is real. It is a risk with the tool, and it's sort of like saying cars don't kill people on the road. No, of course they do, and car accidents kill a lot of people, thousands of people. It doesn't mean that they're not useful, but it means that you have to address the issue that you can die in a car accident, right? And so you have to think about it. And so it is a real risk of a tool that, by virtue of working effectively on a global namespace and the way it executes, tends naturally to move you away from a workflow of encapsulated libraries. The trick is how not to throw away the baby with the bathwater, how not to tell people, oh, stop here, export your code to a .py and lose the interactivity, because the point is that interactivity has a lot of value.
Yeah, I think a tool that would be very useful is one that makes the transition from snippets of notebook code into standalone libraries and makes that transition easier. I think that would. I think it's a nice, novel idea to say, let's take some code that exists in this other notebook that I just want to use right here and right now, but then to take that a level further and say, actually, this is more generally useful that can probably be used by lots of people outside of a notebook context. And how do we go from, okay, this is kind of like my little experimental brain dump in a notebook, to this is actually a published library that I'm willing to have other people use, and making that transition seamless. A huge value.
And I think, sorry, go ahead.
This is where the Atom Hydrogen plugin seems to excel as well. I mean, they approach it from the other standpoint, take an IDE and make it more notebook-like rather than a notebook, and make it integrate more with an IDE. And there can be solutions that meet in the middle here too.
So hi, This is Leo from Graphistry.
Hi, Leo.
First of all, just hello to everybody. We've been using notebooks for security analytics here, and really excited. So what Pete just showed, I was actually both really excited and actually really frightened. And basically what's going on is he showed how to do function extraction within a notebook of basically how do we want to reuse that analysis, which is really exciting. Except for then the way it was done was by getting the scientists to do code copying, code cloning, which is exactly what you don't want for function abstraction. So I just wanted to point it out. It was it got there, and then it became a code clone, because now you're going to have copy and paste bugs everywhere. So, but anyway, I just wanted to but I think it was almost there.
Yeah, no, but I'm glad that we're all thinking about this, and you guys have already been doing a lot of the work on this machinery. So this is a fantastic start.
Yeah, just one comment before we get back to Gino, Fernando.
Yeah.
And that is one of the motivators behind this for us is about quality of the ecosystem. When you start Googling around finding notebooks, whether it's for reuse or whatever, as people start building notebooks and publish them, if people start thinking about not only how you document your code, how you build your notebook for reuse, thinking ahead of how building it for reuse as you're doing your notebook.
Yes.
Not all notebooks are going to be something that's going to be importable, but as you construct your notebook, as we do with some of our customers for analytics, this becomes a really nice way to think ahead of how you're organizing your project. And when you do go publish it, it becomes more of I think it's about a quality statement about the ecosystem. So.
Yeah. And honestly, the way we've done it is, typically the first pass through, we don't know what's reusable, right? We typically find these recipes over time, and then, like I hinted at, we develop these notebooks that become sort of cookbooks. And whether they're cookbooks that people are now automatically copy pasting from, which I agree, you're just propagating, potential bugs, or cookbooks you're invoking as APIs, right? We don't know what the sweet spot is yet, right? It's just sort of bringing up the conversation of, what can we be doing that's better than plain old copy paste. Right.
Yeah.
And if I can,
go ahead.
If I can add something, I've seen two major modes for using a notebook. One is a sort of souped up REPL, which encourages the copy paste type of thing, the interactive exploration. But also the other is, an interactive document that's more like a paper with explanation and really embodies sort of the ideas of literate programming and things like that, in which case you might say it's an even, more polished and finished product than a typical code library. And so it's interesting bridging the gap here between the interactive REPL, explorations to here's something that is documented and, has graphics and everything and is an portable library. This is an interesting thing to think about, how to help people bridge that gap to be a library of literate programs.
Jason, that's kind of exactly how I'm thinking about it, and I don't want to derail IBM's presentation completely with just one of the topics, but that's pretty much how I'm thinking about it. Is how to build that bridge from those two ends, basically, and rather than saying that those two ends can't meet and that you have to at one point throw one tool away to cross over to the other because there are two things that cannot meet. I think that we can think about a continuum between those 2 points.
Right. Do we try to move forward with a demo and start to discuss at the end?
Yes. Come on. All right, Gino.
All right. So I'm sharing. Can you guys see my screen?
No, we're still seeing your face. We're not seeing your screen yet.
So do I just do that?
You have to, when you click on share screen, it normally asks you whether you want to share your entire desktop or an application, and then we should be seeing whatever you choose. Okay, now we're, yep, there we go.
All right, I have to kill the camera first. All right, so widgets. I figured I'd put a brief slide up before I go into demo, just to kind of give you an overview of what I'm going to show you. The widgets work that we're tackling is really intended to do two things. One, we want to build these interactive areas in the notebook. We want to make them easier to build, but also very rich and very, taking advantage of latest technologies, things like that. And at the same time, we want to create an environment for widgets that can translate easier between different kernel languages, right? So that's really the two main goals that we were set forward to tackle with this project. The way we've done that is, what I'm going to show you is a notebook with our extension installed. And our extension does a couple of things. At the middle layer here, it's just a regular UI extension that brings some extra dependencies into the notebook. In our case, we've elected to use web components and Polymer as a way of authoring and constructing these rich areas, partly because Polymer has the data binding capabilities that make it very easy to hook things together. Second, there's this ecosystem of web components that's developing that you just really want to tap into that ecosystem and bring it into your notebook and be able to build your rich environments without having to do a lot of JavaScript development, a lot of HTML authoring, just basically use this ecosystem of widgets that are out there. And so that's what the UI layer gives us, that foundation of Polymer and web components that we build on top. On top of that, we are creating our own custom set of elements using web components. We have a core set of elements those are the ones that I want to really emphasize, because it's kind of what shows how we tackle the problem a little bit different than IPyWidgets, which is we've elected to do the widgets that I called hybrid widgets that have a presence in the browser and on the kernel are really non-visual widgets. These are widgets that represent constructs that you put in your code cells, like functions, data frames, and really leave the visual widgets into more of a web space that they don't really need to know about kernels. They can come in from anywhere, third parties, or even some of the ones that we put together in our Vids package, and connect to the core widgets to then interact with the code cells that are executing in the kernel. So you'll see some of those widgets in our demo. So obviously we have some kernel extensions to support the language-specific sides of these hybrid components. We did our implementation starting with Python first, but we also wanted to prove that we can move it to other kernels. So we also have support for this Spark kernel that's running Scala. just as an exercise of identifying what from IPyWidgets is the minimum core set of things that really are the things that all kernels should implement. And then on top of that, you can build either more IPyWidget stuff or something like this that it's portable across those kernels. And then we have a little notebook server extension that runs on the front end that allows us to, okay, so if I go to the web and I find a third-party component in one of these catalogs and I want to bring it in, how can I load it into my notebook without having to package it in the notebook install that I have? And so we have a little extension there. So it's a collection of plug points that come together and comes out as the widget system. All right, so let me give you a quick tour. So I put together this notebook page, nothing fancy here. You'll see a more comprehensive dashboard looking thing when Pete presents using some of our widgets, but here is just really intended to show you some of our elements and how they work and what they do. So, let's start with function first, right? So what I have here is this is running Python. I have a function called load data. It has arguments and return types. And I want to use that function in my interactive area. So my interactive areas right now, we're authoring using the HTML magic. And you'll see common throughout all of them, we're using the template tag. That template tag is where data binding can take place inside data binding. Now this is, guys, this is prototype, right? It's very raw. Some of these things might make sense to push into its own magic or less coding, but for now, this is the state of the technology, right? The main thing that I highlight about this template is that we have our function element, which basically refers to a function by name, and then it's able to assign that function arguments. And here I'm using the Polymer style bindings with double mustache, which gives that a binding variable a name. And then I can tie that to other elements. In this case, I'm tying that to this form widget, this form element. And I'm just using basic HTML, no fancy widgets here. And I'm binding an input field to that argument. And then also you see elements, when you create elements using web components, you can add API to them. So the function element has an invoke function. And so here, on submitting the form, I'm invoking the function. So I execute that, and I basically get some HTML. Right now, I can call it. It's not really doing anything because you can't see the results. But as you can see, there's actually a result attribute here. That's also bound to another bounding variable. So I can come in another cell, and I can actually add a visual widget. In this case, I'm using the vis table widget. And the vis table widget it's really we wanted to create a couple of visual widgets to prove that we can talk to these core widgets, right? So, everybody needs a table. And so we were wrapping some well-known, Hanson table is a well-known table widget, and we're wrapping it into our own elements. And using these data binding techniques, I'm actually able to bind it to the result of the function, which in this case, the function is returning a pandas data frame. All right, so what happened here? So I loaded data. Let me change it to trips2. That changes the argument. Load calls the function through the function element. It goes and invokes load data on the kernel. That returns a new pandas data frame. The data comes out, and as you can see, my table, which is bound to the result, is updated. And I'll show you again. So you see that the data changed, right? Now this table, one of the things that we want to do is also bring interactivity between the visual components easily. In this case, this table is exposing its selection as a variable. And so I got selection, I'm calling it cell. Whenever I select that, exposes selection. So now I want to do something with that selection. So can come out to another cell here. And again, I'm breaking up into cells for also demo purposes. This could be all in one cell. But one of the nice things about another extension that we did in widgets is that you can actually, across cells, you can advertise data binding changes. So here you see in this cell at the top, I'm creating the selection binding, but I'm actually using it in this cell behind, and that's possible because of Earth Core Bind widget. And here I'm going to actually use a Google map. And so I run that, and that's my Google map. And now that little bit of markup is basically giving me a Google map that's bound to my table through the selection. It's actually showing a marker for the pickup. Actually, I didn't explain what the data was. This data is taxi trips, pickups, and drop-offs. And so here I'm actually visualizing the drop-off and the pickup of the cab. And I can actually click, and as I'm selecting the table, I'm getting that interactivity happening. Right? So I get that with very, very little markup.
Nice.
Now, another example here. So that shows you function, data binding across cells. It shows you bringing in third-party components like the Google Map. It shows you using HTML components right off the bat. Not a lot of JavaScript here, almost nothing except for this unsubmit line, which could probably be made better. And yeah, that's that. Now, another core element that we created is the data frame. And basically because, Pandas has data frames, and we're pretty interested in Spark, and Spark has data frames. And so we wanted to abstract or proxy data frames out into the browser space. So here I'm going to load another data set. This data set brings in information about fares. And here in one cell, I basically use the data frame element to refer to the data frame by name. And then the value of that data frame, I'm exposing it with the data shortcut or binding variable. I'm limiting that to 10 rows, and I'm immediately following it by the other.
This is automatically pulling. When you say ref equals fares, the JavaScript is automatically pulling from the Python namespace because fares is a name in the Python namespace.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
So think about it. It's proxying this fares reference or variable out into the space. And now exposing it inside the web space or the template as another name, the data. I could have used fares. I just want to, I'm going to tell you what I'm showing you here in a second. But fares is exposed as the data. It's immediately bounded to another table. And here you can see now this table, when we print, if we print fares here, right, we get our standard sort of table that you cannot release, kind of static. So, the table we're building, it just adds a little bit extra, right? So you got columns that you can resize, you can do some sort of, you can do sorting. And so what we're envisioning is some of these gestures can translate back to events that you can listen to and do things like the selection that I showed earlier. Right? Now, one quick thing to show is that this Earth core bind element is quite nice. It allows you to bind across cells, but it also allows you to create independent channels from one another. So if you saw previously in the previous demonstration here, I already defined something called the data, but I'm in this global default channel that it's called default, right? And these guys are using, but I can define my own separate channel and still reuse the same names, and they don't collide because now I'm in my own little private channel of data binding, and that's a nice feature to have there. So now
I have a quick question. I have just a real quick question about this. You said you can click and it will sort. It's only sorting based on the limited 10 items that were retrieved, right? It's not actually propagating that back to a server-side sort?
Yeah, no, it's not yet. But the idea would be that the sort click would be some sort of event that would fire by the table, and then you can bind it to the data frame and have the data frame sort, right? So right now, data frame is really a read-only sort of element, but we're thinking about how can it have more API to be able to do more of the common data frame things that you might want to do. But yeah, right now it's doing client-side sorting. You're right. Let's see here. We're doing some aggregations, and I'm creating from this data set that is really the fares. It basically has each tab driver has a total amount of what they earn. We want to aggregate that, and we want to show the top earners, right? So here, again, I'm just doing the same thing. I got top earner, I got another data frame element, and I have it binded to the table. But it would be nice to also see that as a chart. So in our Vis package, we have a chart element. And you can see that actually renders the top earners. Some glitches here that we're working on, but you can see these are the top earners in that data set. One of the nice things about some of these, both function and data frame has this capability, has this extra attribute that we called auto, right? And what that lets it do is it basically says this data frame element is going to observe when the data frame changes and advertise, and it basically picks up the new value. So just watch for this. It's kind of quick, but here I'm now visualizing all the top earners, but right here I'm going to redefine top earners, only the people that are paying with credit card, right? And I'm going to rerun that cell. And just by running that cell, the visualizing chart changed. It didn't have to do anything. Actually, I think there's CSH for cash. So I can come back here and type CSH and rerun it, and the whole thing changes, right? So there's a level of observation that these core widgets are doing on these values in the kernel to get updated when things change back then, right? So that's a quick tour of core elements. One thing, I'm going to fly by the seat of my pants here. This is actually running on a separate branch. One thing that's happened in this demo that I'm showing you here is at this state of this code, we're actually bundling in things like the Google Maps and Marker and some of the other Polymer elements. We bundle them into our extension just because at that point we wanted to say, okay, we want a healthy set of widgets. We just bring a bunch of Polymer widgets, and then you can use them to build. And you'll see in Pete's demo how they put those together. But one of the things that we've been working on is, okay, so what if you go, for example, to one of these sites, right, Polymer Catalog, and you say, oh, there's a gold elements, and yeah, I need to bring in a credit card input field or an emailed input field, right? And these are pretty nice catalog of all sorts of prepackaged things. It already does validation for you and things of that sort. There's also other catalogs like this. Is this component kitchen, and this one is just third party all over the place. There's a lot of stuff here. And this is what we want to enable. You guys basically finding one of these you like it, bring it in. So for example, if you click on gold credit card input, you'll see that typically on a web application, you have to do a Bower install of that component, and that happens at build time, right? And they have a name, Polymer Elements Gold CC, and then to actually use it in the page, you have to link it into the page. So one of the things we've done is we've created this extension to the link element in HTML, where it just looks like a regular link element. It still has your href to bring in your component, but it also has this extra attribute we call package, which is that package, Bower package that defines the element. So an example here is, if I execute this cell, gold credit card input, that guy doesn't exist. It's not in my notebook server, so I need to bring it in. So actually, I'm going to bring in, just for security, I'm going to bring in my console, just so that I can see if it's actually working. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to execute this line of code, and just from the notebook, I'm basically telling the notebook, I want to use gold credit card, but it's actually in this package, Polymer Elements / gold credit card input. I execute that, and what's happening in the background is that that extension that I mentioned, that we actually add another RESTful interface to the front end, a server for the notebook, that it's actually grabbing and doing Bower installs for us. And when it finishes Bower installing, and actually it's faster than this, except that my network is incredibly slow. Once it actually finished doing Bower install, it'll link in that widget into the page, and all of a sudden now I can use gold credit card input in my notebook. And so these guys at the top here are examples of widgets or elements that I brought in after the fact. So they were not packaged in with Earth, they were not packaged in with Notebook, with Jupyter, they were brought in from the notebook by using one of our import elements. There you go, card number. So you see, it's kind of quick. So once that's done, now I have the card number element here, and I think this guy, if you do certain numbers, it figures it out what number it is, what credit card it is. I'm not actually, let's look for an example here, right? So you can keep demo, and you can take this number here, bring it back to the right. And so I mean, it's one of these Google widgets that have the material design things in there. Yeah. So I was also going to try to show you guys Scala, but unfortunately I didn't have enough time to build the image to show you the Scala work. But what you can see from that work, what you will be able to see is that all this will be the same. Everything here will be the same, except that instead of using a def function, we will be using Python code here. We're using Scala code, but the whole interface will be the same because what you're doing is interfacing with functions, and there's functions in Scala, right? So we find them, we bring them out into the surface, but all the widgetry and everything like that just works. And I'll leave it at that.
All right, for the sake of time, Pete, why don't we jump to Pete, and then we can have some room for questions, okay?
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. And clearly you can hear me. Okay. So to tie Gino's widgets story back into another context, I mean, widgets are useful for notebook users exploring, as you're within the notebook trying to visualize, so on, build reports in the classic sense. We found another use case in our work with Jupyter IPython, in that sometimes the artifact we're trying to deliver is actually an interactive dashboard, right? That majority of the time, yes, there's a report, there's some kind of explanation of some kind of, data analysis that we've done, the result of modeling and so on. But sometimes it's, here's what we did, here's what we found, and see for yourself, to people who are not notebook users, right? Certainly we can share notebooks around, people can rerun them, but for business stakeholders that are not interested in the code necessarily, but do want to poke at the results a bit more, right? We found this need to actually produce dashboards. So classically what we've done is, sure, we prototype everything in a notebook, and then we stop, and then we go build the dashboard web app, right? And we do the same old, I'm going to copy paste some code. We might turn the notebook into a Python script and try to munge it up into the app that we need and so on. But we're looking for, is there a simpler way to turn notebooks into standalone dashboards, right?
Yep.
So again, it's a prototype, and I know the community is interested in this too. So we put out a blog post showing a Scotch dashboard using the classic IPython widgets, right? I'm going to do a different one today just to show how extreme this could get. This is a notebook where we took some data for this fictitious cloud company about service usage. What customers using what services, some stats about those customers. We actually did some association rules training to actually find, recommendations based on market basket analysis of, what services a seller for this company, this Acme cloud company, could recommend to customers depending on, what other services they're using, right? So it's sort of more of a business intelligence notebook than anything, right? There's a lot of training and modeling that went on in other notebooks, and this notebook sort of tries to tie it together into, okay, my artifact is this dashboard for sellers. How can I pull it all together, right? So just briefly looking at the code, right, I'm reading some data. Again, this is sample, some functions, which are going to do some plotting. I think in total, this is about 30 code cells, right? There's a little bridge, which was just 2 people worked on this, and they didn't quite agree on what the API was going to be for the functions. Some styling, right? And we get into actually, you see some of Gino's declarative widgets down here. And in this case, we largely wrote our own right here in line. This was done before we started actually having the ability to import others. So you'll see a lot of widget creation, right, in this notebook too, right? And clearly over time, back to where's the ecosystem of these things, right? Can I pull them in from other sources? You would hopefully start to see less and less of these things right in your notebook, like that I need a widget to do a table, right? We wrote our own table. I need a widget to do these pickers, right? And so on, right? So in traditional notebook layout, it would look something like this, right? So I see pieces of what might be called a dashboard kind of going down. And as I interact with them, if I were up here, I could pick, different values for what customers I want to see, which is what these are bound to. Things further down in the notebook are changing, but I got to scroll, right? I got to look around for where they are. It's very linear, right? So what we implemented is the ability to do, first of all, layout of the dashboard. So you can see these are actually cells, the output of the cells, the code is hidden, right? I can resize, right? So I could, if I really wanted to, though the layout was pretty good to start with, totally muck this thing up and, say, this one's going to go somewhere down here. And I don't know, right? I could lay out the cells how I thought would be better for this particular dashboard, right? Maybe the plot I want it to be smaller. Maybe I want to move things up, so on, right? I can take cells out of the flow. So you see there's cells hidden down here. So there's things in the notebook that, things that are just code cells. I don't want those in my dashboard. Get rid of them, right? But I have the option of, well, maybe this heading would have been a good title for the dashboard. So let me pull it up, let me try to drag it up to the top here. Of course, now I'm going to try scrolling for the first time in this zoomed in mode. And I could start moving it up and you could see, obviously, it needs some work, right? But there we go. Now it's got a new title, right? And if I'm happy, I can take it back out, right? So layout is one thing we worked on, right? Another that dawned on us as we were doing this, and as you see as I mouse out, right, it sort of shows me the dashboard, what it's going to look like as a whole without the individual cells broken down. We implemented just the plain, now fix it, right? Let me interact with it as the dashboard right here in Jupyter, right? Because we foresee, before we start worrying about, I'm going to deploy a separate dashboard app. No, notebook users who create these dashboards, who create these layouts, who have this extension, or maybe it gets folded into Jupyter somehow in the main line, right? All this layout information is just getting stored in the notebook metadata. So if I ship this notebook to Gino, who has the same extensions installed, he can open it in this mode and just interact with it, right? Clearly, he's got to run all, so on and so forth, right? But this is sort of a first pass at, I could use the dashboard here, right? And, as I interact with these pickers, I want to see the bottom 10 monthly plan, cancel pending accounts by, again, for this fictitious cloud company services, right? I could start to click through these things. You'll see the account information's updating down here. This is anonymous info. Don't worry, it's generated. It's not an actual customer of anybody. See what services they're using, right? And if I was building this for the purposes of handing my sales team a dashboard, I could do all the work in notebooks. I could then build them a prototype, a rough cut, just good enough dashboard, and then outside of Jupyter, which is the step we're working on, go and deploy this as a standalone app. And this is where it gets interesting and starts to tap into what the community's done with Thebe, with JustExec, and the idea of I want to reuse notebooks transformed, not within the Jupyter Notebook server solely, but as standalone applications, right? Running off on the cloud somewhere, calling back into a, let's call it a kernel service, right? That runs on some big compute cluster where all this data resides, right? And have this UI powered by those backend kernels without having to go and re-implement everything, right? So I'm not going to be able to deploy this one because we're still working on it, so I could show you the Scotch one deployed, right? So if you're able to see my URL bar here, it's actually running on IBM Bluemix. It doesn't really matter where it's running, right? This is a notebook where we took, we did this analysis notebook, did the layout, went and downloaded the app. You get a little zip file. I don't know if you can see this Finder window I've got here, but it's a zip file where we include a Docker file, a Cloud Foundry manifest, a little PHP file just pulling in Thebe or whatever. You could deploy that front end wherever you want, right? The guts of the thing is still some kernel running somewhere, today powered by TempMB, powered by Thebe, right? But in the end, you wind up with a standalone web app that, no one would know that this came from a notebook unless, somehow we advertise that or they were really paying attention to, well, that looks like a Jupyter drop-down widget. So, again, the goal here is how do you improve the time to value in the sense of I did my analysis in notebooks. I just want to work in notebooks. I'm not a web developer that wants to step outside and write a whole new app. We're not saying that's a bad thing. That's clearly one flow everyone's doing today. But can you empower the notebook user to produce these tiny, just good enough dashboards quickly and easily right from within the notebook environment? Right?
No, and this is very much what we had put in our original grant proposal, that this will cover a vast amount of use cases where the original developers are in the notebook, and this gives also the possibility that you could imagine these dashboards actually having a mode where there's a sort of get me the technical help button somewhere in there, where if you click on that, a notebook, an actual notebook server is enabled in the back end through a different URL, and the technical person can see the underlying notebook that is behind this dashboard through a notebook server to go and do debugging, for example, if there's a problem. And they can see the underlying code that is powering this and go and fix whatever the problem is. And then the person who's having the problem can just reload the page, for example, or refresh the view, and the problem is fixed.
Yeah, life cycle management is a big question for notebooks in general, right? So the idea of, great, I published this, now someone interacts with it and says, well, that's great, but you're missing my favorite scotch in this case, or in the sales case, no, I also need to see this information. How do you do version 2, right? So we've started thinking about that, the idea of these have been transformed into plain old web apps. I go back to my notebook, do I change it there? What's the collaboration story? How do I redeploy it? Yeah. All interesting work to be done there. So
yeah, but if there's a close, if this is truly generated from the notebook and metadata in the notebook, then that process can be cleanly managed.
Yep.
Yeah. So very, very cool work, guys. Very impressive.
I guess with that, we've got about 7 minutes left. We can open it up for questions across the board. And then one question I have is, where do we go from here, Fernando?
I don't know, folks. Questions? I think I would love to hear from other people from the audience. Jason, Sylvan, Chris, Brian. I know that you folks have also put a lot of thought into these kinds of questions as well. So we have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, Leo from Graphistory. I'm curious about the security model, especially for the workflow. It was kind of cool to hear that you guys are thinking about exporting a dashboard into a standalone, so that does work. I guess I'm curious in terms of is basically security around the content management, for example, editing the dashboards or editing the original notebooks. Is that on the radar?
It has to be, right? So that's actually one of the big things where we say using it within Jupyter today, like you saw me flip between layout and just using it right there. That's nice and simple because I'm in my own environment, right? I don't have to worry about giving anyone else access here. I could just share the notebook with them potentially. But at the moment you start talking about deploying it out, and the way we're going about it today with things like Thebe, I mean, if I switch back to showing you that Scotch deployed dashboard, the code's all right there in the HTML because that's how Thebe works today, right? The code is sent from the HTML back to a kernel. And clearly, as soon as you start thinking about, like, can I trust this dashboard user, right? That's not going to fly, right? That code has to be moved to the back end of the dashboard, right? The kernel access probably has to be controlled in some way, API keys, so all of those things to take this beyond, like, it's for open reusable dashboards, right? And open, anyone could walk up to use, and it's not for confidential data. Those problems have to be solved, right? And that ties a little bit back to why I'm talking to Kyle about the kernel provisioning API and how you secure it and things like that, right?
So how much of the notebook JavaScript did you actually keep everything in this dashboard mode, or you managed to strip out?
Is everyone else hearing this? I'm losing audio.
Can you repeat, Sylvan? Your audio got choppy.
I was asking whether it removed all the unnecessary JavaScript and resources that were in the classical notebook web app, or if it actually exposes everything in this dashboard mode and deployed web app mode.
Right. So what we did in this, first 30-day exercise was just use what O'Reilly Media put out with Thebe and what Kyle helped them with, which was a lot of copy-paste reuse of JavaScript code from Jupyter. We didn't innovate anything at that level. We're just showing a different use case for that type of work. So right now, a lot of the Jupyter code is copied in. It doesn't need to be there, right? This is why I think a lot of the refactoring that's going on with the Jupyter.js services work, and again, back on the back end, can we have a kernel API for just getting kernels instead of entire notebook servers just to launch a kernel, right? All that's got to fall into place to make these deployed dashboards a more robust answer. Right?
So I've got two other questions. Did you consider any other API than having a markup language? I mean, like some extension of HTML, or do you also expose their, like pure Python API to it?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that we're cognizant about is that it's an HTML interface into creating the widgets. But one of the things that we're considering is, in terms of exposing a kernel language API, can we expose an API that it's more generic and not really new function element or new data frame element? Rather, let's create a new element and use the parameters of that constructor to pass what type of element we want to create. So something more abstract to the element that you're building rather than specific to the widget library. And that mainly is to reduce the amount of API landscape that you have to port between kernel languages, right? Make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Sorry, I had some interruption, so yeah, I heard everything.
I've got a question. It wasn't entirely clear to me when you were demoing the dashboarding capabilities. Does making those dashboards, does that require the use of Polyver widgets, or does it enable you to dashboard from any notebook content?
Anything. We're basically just recording some metadata in the notebook format saying this cell goes at row 1, column 1, that kind of thing. And then within the notebook, all we're doing is, CSS rules, a little bit of JavaScript to hide the guts around the cells, right? And clearly all that's going to change over time, but whatever was in the content of that output area is going to be shown, right? When it's deployed, it's again, we're based on Thebe today because we don't want to go reinvent that for this initial exercise. We're using actually NB convert under the covers with a little Jinja template to lay out for lack of a better term, Thebe compatible markup, right, for in the HTML. And there we strip away, right, we don't include any of the cell output, it's really just the code, and then we rely on Thebe and its copied bits of the notebook code to go and generate what it needs to get the output into the deployed dashboard page.
So for the dashboarding layout, was that like Gridster or Phosphor or anything like that?
It's a grid stack. We actually tried Gridster first and had some horrible problems interacting with the existing markup, so we switched. Yes, it's grid stack.
Awesome. And then for the kind of getting back to Peter Wang's question about backing the data frame on the server rather than having pure client-side interactions for the data, like I'm guessing what Peter was getting at was like, is the thought like, adopt Bokeh and just reuse their model, or like do something new, or is there maybe something else that like just connect to the kernel and then make some new common interface? Like what's the thinking there?
Yeah, I think we haven't make any decisions really on what that should be. I think using something that already exists, it sounds good to me, right? I think the key thing that we're really trying to keep intact is, okay, so you're interacting with a data frame. It should be the same sort of integration or interaction on the notebook browser side, regardless of whether you're sitting on a Pandas data frame or on a Spark data frame or on a Scala notebook or on an R notebook, right? Can there be some sort of unified set of APIs around that, so that your front end code doesn't really have to change or know that much about the back end?
Cool. And then more
Hey, guys.
practically,
Sorry.
sorry.
I was just going to say, actually, the Bokeh.js, the Bokeh objects do all we have Scala and R and Python bindings and somewhat Lua bindings, as well as what was I going to say? Crap. We've documented all the models actually as the JSON. So we actually have well documented JSON that describes what the wire format should look like essentially for the encoding of these things. So and that includes both tabular things as well as even some predefined kinds of callbacks that we find to be very common in kind of interactive visualization.
Yeah. That more at a pragmatic question. I'm really excited and want to try it. So, what like maybe this is for the chat menu, but like any pointers of what should we do?
We're working on it, right?
Yeah, I think I'll let Dan speak for it, but it's really what's the next step, right? We want to contribute this stuff out. It's extensions. What's the best path forward? But
I mean, honestly,
so I think there's a couple different paths. Oh.
Go ahead.
Are you talking for now?
Go ahead. That's fine.
I think there's a couple different levels of next steps. I think some of the things really would make sense to just submit as pull requests to existing repos. For example, the search capabilities for the notebook. Like I don't see any reason we wouldn't consider that as something that's part of the main notebook. I think for some of the bigger things, it probably makes sense to have an enhancement proposal that we can use to discuss some of the design questions around this. I think there's even some stuff where more of a full-blown incubation model might make sense to help you guys get the code out publicly before the pull requests or enhancement proposals are actually formalized and approved.
Brian, that's an approach I actually favor, because it also allows us to use those incubation assets in other gigs that we're working on while the open source kind of figures out how it wants to go forward.
Yeah, we're happy to start that.
I think as a project, there's a few details about the incubation that we want to work out. I think we can work those out pretty quickly. We have. I'm going to be posting the new governance repo very soon, and I think it's just a matter of us sort of as a community, and I can take the lead on this, and I'd love input from you, Dan, about what does incubation look like for our project, and submit a pull request against that governance repo and do it. And part of where we would love feedback is that we have interacted with other companies that would like to engage us in a similar way. And I would really love all three of your thoughts on what's the best way for us to structure the project to encourage this type of interaction, to make it easy for you, and also to get the community buy-in and interest in these things.
Okay. Yeah, let's take that offline, but I'm eager to talk to you about it this week.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm this governance repo and the incubator pull request against that is right at the top of my to-do list right now. So, I can work on it this afternoon. So, okay. But in the meanwhile, also, from my perspective, some of this stuff is a no-brainer. Start submitting pull requests against the notebook or the appropriate repos for the smaller stuff, I would say.
I have a quick question. This is awesome. I love the stuff you guys have been doing. Where do you see this evolving, particularly like the dashboard and the Polymer widgets and things like that? Do you have ideas for where you want to take this in the future?
Well,
Lots, I imagine.
Well, so I'll let Peter and Gino answer as well, but I'll start off with first part is validation. Not only talking to our customers about this, but seeing how the open source community embraces these notions of dashboards and the declarative widgets. I mean, that's initial validation. If it's embraced there, then it has legs, and that gives us motivation to go further with it. Peter, Gino, any other thoughts?
Go ahead, Gino.
No, I was seeing your lips moving, so I gotta stop. Yeah, I would say that from my perspective, I'm very excited about. I think I talked about this a little bit last time. Is looking at the notebook as a new way of building applications. Maybe not like these super scalable, high demand applications, but hey, I go in there, I write my backend code, I write my front end code, I lay it out, have rich widgets, powerful backends, data, and hey, deploy it, and it's an app. That's exciting.
And I would say from my perspective, I think it's interesting, taking dashboards as one use case, for example, to sort of drive, some of the refactoring work, or applying that refactoring work, like I mentioned before, the Jupyter.js services, right? So this idea of having a node library that can talk to a kernel provisioner and get a kernel. Well, for what reason, right? So clearly the notebook interface is one reason, right? Having that code be reusable even within Jupyter, but also, what else can we do with that? Well, dashboards are one thing, right? Kyle's work and O'Reilly's work on Thebe is another, the gist exec, right? I'm excited to see, well, what else, right? This is all in a short amount of time, I believe. What else could you do with these things once the plumbing exists?
That's Peter. I'm delighted to hear you go in that direction, because that's very much a line of thought that we have, that we want to push forward, right? Is we want to think of this as effectively low-level plumbing that should be adopted in a very pervasive fashion, right? We want to see sort of little kernels everywhere.
Yeah.
Lots of little kernels everywhere, and we think of this as an architecture that should be lightweight, simple, and that you want to put in a kernel wherever you want to have data that you want to put compute next to. You should be able to plop in a kernel next to it and activate effectively stateful interactivity next to your data wherever you want it, and whether it's in Lua or in Python or in whatever, and whether you're running a heavy-duty Spark deployment with 100 or 1,000 nodes, or a Raspberry Pi or a MicroPi microcontroller, right? Talking powered by a solar cell, and running and sending data over a cell phone SIM. That shouldn't matter. It's the same protocol, the same code, and that's sort of where we see this. So I love to hear you thinking in that direction, Peter.
Cool.
Okay, folks, I don't want to keep everybody from the rest of their day. We've been at it for a little bit over 2 hours. Does anybody have any other questions? Chris, from your side, if you're still on the call.
Yeah, no questions from my side.
Okay. I'm sorry, did anybody speak up? Okay, well, if not, I would like to thank you folks, the IBM team. This was a fantastic demo. It was extremely informative and useful, and will continue. I would echo what Brian said. Everything that is kind of small and bite-sized, let's start by contributing all of that upstream into the repos. There's a lot of really useful and kind of digestible functionality that we would love to see in pull requests. And the bigger items, so we can set up a process for seeing how we can incubate kind of standalone repos in a bigger process, so that the community can discuss at large, and other bigger stakeholders can sort of discuss how the bigger ideas can come into the bigger stream of the project. But just having you folks come over, demonstrate this, and bring this into the conversation is extremely interesting. So very, very much appreciated. Thanks, everybody. It was very useful.
Thanks,
bye, folks.
Guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Cheers.